Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today. This is my first time at WebSci', so I'm very excited to meet all of you and to get to know the community. The motivation for this talk actually comes from this concept of splinter nets. The idea that even though the web and the internet has allowed information to flow across borders and national boundaries in a way that we haven't seen before, increasingly governments are putting barriers to that flow of information, whether it's regulatory barriers or technical barriers. Increasingly around the world, we see impositions on the flow of information. But at the same time, I don't think we have a lot of information on what that flow looks like. And so in the talk that I'm going to give today, I'm going to focus on China, which I think arguably has the most extensive and sustained blocking of information flows in and outside of its borders. So the questions that orient this research really are around how much information flows into China from the global information ecosystem, and how does that inflow occur? So this is based on a few papers, working papers, as well as published papers around the subject. So starting with how do you study information inflow? One of the ways that we approach this is thinking about, okay, we'll start with topics that capture public attention around the world, and then which of those conversations makes its way to public discussions inside of China. In the first paper I'll talk about, we're focusing just on Twitter as a proxy, and English language Twitter in particular as a proxy. So looking at viral tweets as a proxy for global public discussions, and then public discussions on Weibo in China as a proxy for public discussions in the country. So Weibo is a platform that's very similar to Twitter in that it's a micro blogging format that is open, so you don't need to be in a network to see content. Here we are using Twitter data that was collected by others. It's about 200 million daily active users. And then for Weibo, this is the size of the two platforms is very similar, even though for Weibo, the size of the users are based almost exclusively in China. And the data that we're using is collected by Chen et al. In 2020. It's 14 million English language tweets related to COVID-19 from January to April 2020. So this project is really just focused on the emergence of COVID. And so keep that in mind as you see the results. And then among those tweets, we identify 1.8 million that are related to China, just based on keywords. And then from those, we select a very small number of what we're calling viral tweets. So it's looking at each week, what were the tweets that gained the most engagement, user engagement. And in the figure here, you can see that the sample tweets are much, and this is a y-axis is a log scale. So the retweet volume of the sampled tweets are much higher than the full sample. So we're looking at these tweets that captured global conversations, at least English language global conversations, and looking at how and whether they appear in Chinese social media. So for identifying whether they appear in Chinese social media, we're using a data set of 40 million Weibo posts from a data set that others collected, and from those identifying 6.7 million from the same time period. And we do a little bit more to make sure that the posts are actually about COVID-19. So here in this paper, we're looking at co-occurrence. So we're really looking at exact matches of content. And the goal is to determine whether these English language tweets appear in Chinese on Weibo. And so this is a multilingual task, and it's cross-platform. And even though we have a very small number of global viral tweets that we're looking at, there's a large search set that we're looking for them in. And so what we do in this paper is to combine deep learning to retrieve the most likely matches on Weibo, and then using human annotators to find those exact matches for identifying co-occurrence. And so there's this retrieval process, ranking, and then human annotation. For retrieval, we are just using word-to-vec and then cosine similarity to identify the top 10,000 Weibo posts for each tweet. And then we're using a multilingual universal sentence encoder to rank those Weibo posts and to look at the top 100. And then human annotators look at those top 100 to see if it's a match. Okay. So that's co-occurrence, but we're really interested in inflow of information. And so inflow is when events, ideas, actions, and opinions are originating outside of China, but then flow into China. And this is issue-based, it's not agreement-based. So you could be talking about the same thing, but the inflow disagrees with the original opinion. And then we're looking at concrete issues, not the general topic. And this is I would say, qualitative investigation, where we're looking not just at the text in English and Chinese, but at metadata and associated images and links and separate searches to really try to identify how information is flowing in. So what do we find here? This is the 150 tweets. It's not meant for you to be able to actually read them. The x-axis is the time period, and the y-axis is this log retweet count. So this is just to show you that this is how things look across the time period, and there's co-occurrence across the whole time period. So it's not concentrated among a specific time. So of the 150 viral tweets, 68 appear on Weibo. But among those, only 32 represent inflow. And this is an artifact of the thing we're looking at, which is COVID-19, which emerged first in China. And so there's a lot of information that first originated in China and flowed out of the country. But there's kind of 32 viral tweets that originated outside of China and then flowed inside to Chinese social media. And so this is about a quarter of global conversations pertaining to COVID-19 and China made its way back into the country. And you could think about this as a likely ceiling, perhaps, in the sense that COVID-19 is something very salient to China, and we're selecting conversations that are both about the pandemic and the country itself. Then of the inflows, one thing that we were looking for is whether misinformation disproportionately came into the country. And that's not what we see. So about 4% of the viral tweets contained misinformation. About 6% of the inflow contained misinformation. I mean, we should acknowledge that the inflow data is very small, but it doesn't seem that there's disproportionate inflow of misinformation. What there is that's different between the global conversation and the inflow is content that's antagonistic toward China. So about a third of the viral tweets show some antagonism toward China. And this could be toward the Chinese government's handling of the pandemic to racist posts. But then when we look at the inflow, 2/3 of the inflow contain some form of antagonism. And we don't know the reason why that is. It could be some sort of confirmation bias. It could be because of who is funneling that information into the country. But this is a pattern that is striking and disproportionate. Then we look at how did information make its way into the country, and we focus on 4 mechanisms. One is state, media, and government. So when we think of China, we might think that the government has a hold on how information flows into the country. So that's one mechanism. But another one is commercialized media. So media in China all has to have some government registration, but there are outlets whose funding is primarily commercial. So we're looking at commercialized media. Then we look at ordinary Weibo users who have no affiliation with any media or government outlet. And then we look at foreign entities who are directly active on Chinese social media. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of each. This first one is there's an opinion article in February of 2020 from the Wall Street Journal that was titled, "China is the real sick man of Asia." I don't know how much attention this gained in Europe, but in the US it was hotly debated and seen as quite racist. And shortly after this occurred, the Chinese government expelled a number of Wall Street Journal correspondents who are based in China. And at the same time, after that expulsion, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo criticized China for expelling these foreign correspondents and not upholding freedom of press. And so that comment by the then Secretary of State Pompeo is the thing that flowed into China. And that flowed into China a few days later when a Chinese state media outlet reported on Pompeo's remarks. So this is a case where state media is funneling information into the Chinese online environment. There are other examples of this where the inflows are facilitated by Chinese embassies around the world. I'll do this one example. I don't know if anyone here remembers. In April of 2020, there was a German media outlet that criticized China's COVID response. It gained widespread attention on Twitter kind of globally. The Chinese embassy in Germany responds on Twitter and then posts that response both in German, English, and Chinese on China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. And that's how information about the original criticism of China from German media makes its way into China. Okay. All right, and about 10 instances out of the 32 of the inflows are facilitated through state media or Chinese government, through these embassies and consulates. Then when we turn to commercialized media, this is really about time difference between China and the rest of the world. So NetEase News reported that the WHO had convened a meeting to declare COVID-19 a global emergency. That went viral on Weibo, and then hours later it went viral on Twitter. And this is just the time difference between China and Western Europe, North America. But we also see much more convoluted flows of information. So here, Pompeo, Secretary of State, then Secretary of State, is making another remark that's critical of China. Then we see a commercialized media reporting on those remarks and posting to their website, but then a Chinese government account picks up that commercialized media reporting, and that's how we see this information propagate on Chinese social media. And actually, this is posted on Chinese social media before it goes viral on Twitter, because Pompeo didn't post his remarks, which were made on television on Twitter until afterwards. Okay, so 7 instances out of the 32 go through commercialized media. Then we also have instances of ordinary Weibo users facilitating the transfer of inflow of information. So on February 28th of 2020, there was a tweet, coronavirus is like pasta, the Chinese invented it, and then Italians spread it all over the world. Okay, there was no reporting on this on Chinese media, and what we see is that a Chinese Weibo user who is geolocated to Brazil is the one to post this on Weibo. So some of you might remember this from Twitter, but then you have a Weibo user located outside of China moving this to Chinese social media. And we actually see Weibo users posting content from BuzzFeed, Fox News, New York Times, PBS, and other non-Chinese media outlets to Chinese social media. This is a kind of example that brings together lots of different players. So it starts out when an editor of Indian media site tweets a video from an Urdu television channel that Chinese underwear masks were sent to Pakistan. Okay, so this is on Twitter, someone posting a clip from a television. Then 2 days later, the Indian newspaper Business Standard reports on the same issue. And shortly thereafter, you have this outlet called New Tung Dynasty Television, which is an anti-CCP outlet that is banned in China, reporting on the same thing. So they're citing from the Indian newspaper article as well as the original tweet. And then the way this makes its way into Chinese social media is because you have a Weibo user who sees the New Tang Dynasty television reporting and posts on Chinese social media asking, is this fake news? Okay, so it's a very convoluted banned outlets in China and then Chinese social media users. Overall, 12 instances out of the 32 come from these ordinary Weibo users that are not affiliated with traditional media outlets or the Chinese government. And finally, we have 3 instances where we see foreign entities directly active on Chinese social media. One is the Russian embassy in China posting directly on Weibo that Russia is banning travel from China. And you also see MIT Technology Review and an Australian television channel. Okay. So the implication here is that there is some inflow of information from the global information ecosystem into China, but it's limited. Even for a highly salient issue like COVID-19 pertaining to China, only about a quarter of information is flowing into the country. And the Chinese government is a gatekeeper of this information inflow, but it's not the only gatekeeper. And then there's this pattern of greater antagonism toward China is what's flowing into the country. Okay, but the problem with this research, okay, there are lots of problems with this paper, but one of them is that COVID is a very special case that's highly salient to China. Twitter is just one platform, and we're only looking at English to Chinese. And so the next paper looks at the onset of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is obviously something that captured global public attention, but it's not a central as central of an issue to China as COVID-19 was. So we want to understand, how did information about the conflict flow into the country? And specifically here, we're taking a very different approach and looking at what narratives of the Russia-Ukraine war appeared on Chinese social media, and where did those narratives originate. So we use also Weibo data, about 500,000 posts that are related to the conflict that we collected in February to April of 2022. Then we have a data set of news websites. So here we're trying to identify the most popular domains using Alexa Top Million, and then using Cloudflare to identify websites that are news related, and then taking the top 2,500 domains that are .cn, .ru, .ua, and US based. So we're looking at content on Chinese social media and whether it comes from Chinese media domains, Russian media domains, Ukrainian media domains, or US media domains. And then we collect about 24 million articles that are published from January to June of 2020 from those sites. Okay. Then here, instead of the matching that we did in the first paper, we are doing narrative clustering. So we're trying to identify first narratives on Weibo. We're identifying the stance of those narratives. And then we look at whether those narratives appear in the news domains, and then trying to estimate origination. Okay, so first, what are narratives? What I mean by narratives, this is something that differs, I think, by discipline. What we mean here are stories that have an actor, some action, and some outcome. And in telling that story, there's a description of how the world works. So this is not a topic, it's much more specific than a topic. You could have within a topic many different narratives. I also say it's not quite a frame, because frames, I think, may be more cohesive than specific narratives. You could have specific narratives that make up a broader frame. Okay, so to identify narratives, we separate content into passages, we then calculate passage embeddings, and then we identify semantically similar clusters using dp-means clustering, so it's a nonparametric extension of k-means clustering, and we're forming new clusters based on a lambda parameter that we validated through human annotation of the clusters. So we're pretty conservative when it comes to that lambda parameter, because we want to make sure that everything in a cluster is cohesive and really about the same thing. And then we extract human interpretable summaries of each cluster, and we're doing that in an automated way. Okay, so that's the clusters that are on Weibo. Then we look at the narratives, the stance narratives. And here we're looking at specific targets. So the 4 countries that we're gathering data from, those are targets. And then we're estimating the stance, pro, against, and neutral toward those targets. This is, again, using an existing model that we then trained on a passage target pair data set, using Weibo data, so using the same type of data that we're working with. And the coding is that there's a plurality stance label based on all passages in a particular post, since all the posts are separated into these passages. Okay, then now we have narrative clusters, we have the stance of those narratives. Then the next thing is to look at whether those narratives also appear in the news domains. So again, for all the articles that we have, we're separating content into passages. We're then doing embedding of the article text and Weibo together using multilingual models. We first tried to use one multilingual model for all 4 languages, but that just didn't work very well. So instead, we trained 3 bilingual models, so Chinese Russian, Chinese Ukrainian, Chinese English, to identify paraphrases between the 2 languages. Okay, so that's how we identify whether the same passage narrative clusters that are appearing on Weibo also appear in the news website data. Then finally, to estimate the origination of the narratives, because again, you have co-occurrence, but how do we look at origination? We do a really easy thing, which is just looking at the publication date of the news domain versus the Weibo post, and then we also estimate using network-based influence algorithm. They both result in basically the same substantive outcome. Okay, so what do we find? This is a figure showing over the time span the top 10 narratives that appear on Weibo. So I'll just read some of them for you because I don't know if you can see them in the back. The most frequently occurring one is this topic, this narrative that just says military conflict between Russia and NATO broke out in eastern Ukraine, and various sanctions imposed by the US and Europe have the potential to completely destroy Russia. So that is an example of a narrative. Another one, this light orange one that appears a little bit later in the time period, is this narrative that says Russian army entered Ukraine and had just announced that it seized biological laboratories set up by the United States in Ukraine. So this is misinformation, but we see this, identify this as a narrative cluster that appeared on Chinese social media. Okay. When we look at stance, we found something that we weren't expecting. On the bottom are stance toward Russia and Ukraine. And for the most part, the Chinese social media content, the narrative clusters, are neutral toward Russia and Ukraine. There's some pro, some against. But what's much more striking is that on Chinese social media, in content talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, predominantly the posts are anti-United States, and when it comes to China, there's pro-China content and some anti-China content. And this is because many of the narratives, even though they're focused on the war, is talking about how the United States and NATO are the ultimate instigators of the conflict. And as regards to China, the critical content for China is really criticizing, because this is at the beginning of the conflict, criticizing the Chinese government for not evacuating Chinese nationals from Ukraine more quickly. Okay. So then when we look at co-occurrence, where are these stories about the war coming from? We find that the highest level of co-occurrence is with Russian media domains. So that's in the orange here. And again, on the x-axis is time, and y-axis is the proportion of articles in each domain that match with the Weibo content. So the kind of most frequent co-occurrence is the Russian domains in orange, then the Ukrainian domains in red, then US domains, and the least frequent are these Chinese domains, which was incredibly surprising to us because we assumed that information going into Chinese social media would be mediated by Chinese media, that Chinese media would set up the stories about the conflict, and then people in China on Chinese social media would talk about those. But that's really not what we find. We find much more co-occurrence with the Russian and Ukrainian domains. And so this is co-occurrence, and when we look at then inflows, so looking at origination time on the left, and then using the inference algorithm on the right, we find that about a third, or 27%, of Chinese social media narratives first appeared on Russian news websites, 26% first appeared on Ukrainian news websites. So basically, these are the two news domains that Chinese social media users are directly drawing from when it comes to narratives about the war. Then 15% first appeared on US news websites, and only 10% first appeared on Chinese news websites. And if you look at, so the color coding is that Russian domains are in orange, Ukrainian in red, US in purple, and Chinese in blue. But I know you can't see this, but the one blue domain over up here on the right that appears is Sputnik.cn. We're saying that's a Chinese domain because it's the .cn domain, but obviously it's also a Russian outlet. So And I should mention that there's a remaining 22% that we don't find coming from any of these 4 media ecosystems. So we say they first appeared on Weibo, but it's possible that those narratives came from some other media domain that we're not examining. But I think the overall kind of conclusion here is that the Chinese media ecosystem may be more porous than we expect. Yes, you have the Chinese Communist Party that is a gatekeeper, but it's not the case that the Chinese government has a lock hold on all the information coming into the country. And I think the perception that we have that China is isolated and walled off really is informed by where we are, or at least where I am, based in the United States, where US media outlets are not accessible in China. But it's not the case that other foreign media outlets are not accessible in China. And so when we think about the global information ecosystem, there may be splinters, let's say, between the US and China, but that's not to say China is walled off completely on its own. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to the questions. Thank you.